Early on Sunday morning, the 28th of February 1841, a young woman named Mary Fitzsimon made her way along the banks of the River Dodder in Rathfarnham. Mary, a servant in a nearby house belonging to the Weldon family, followed the same route each morning and always took care to savour her last few minutes of freedom before enduring a long day of labour. The air was cold and damp, yet the first tentative birdsong of spring graced her ears as the sun slowly rose above the treetops and the frost that encased the grass at her feet began to glisten. She followed the bend in the river and the familiar sight of Lord Eli's arch came into view, yet her eyes were instead drawn to a spot by the wall where she could just make out the shape of what appeared to be a sleeping man. Nervously, she approached the figure, and as the sun illuminated the scene where he lay, she froze to the spot in terror. Her eyes looked upon the scene of a barbarous murder. The victim's throat had been slashed open from ear to ear, his clothing stained a deep arterial red, while his motionless and staring face was drained of all but the faintest of colour. Domenico Garlibardo, a young Italian organ grinder, had been butchered under the cover of darkness. The flurry of accusations and arrests that followed led to a dramatic and deeply flawed inquest and trial, and it seemed that the true killer would never be identified. As the year drew to a close and the murderer still roamed the streets of the city, two children skipped their way along a dimly lit and narrow laneway off Pembroke Road just 5 days before Christmas. John and Bessie Waters stumbled upon the scene of an even more heinous crime. In a pool of blood on the cobbled ground lay Thomas Maguire, his bare feet blackened from the filthy December streets of Dublin on which he had once walked. He lay motionless and drenched in his own blood, and just like Domenico, his throat had been cut. This time, the victim was just 10 years old. The city was shaken by yet another unspeakably brutal murder, and as the police scrambled to find the killer, a young man hurriedly walked through the gates of Dublin Castle. 17-year-old John Delahunt claimed to have vital information that could identify the killer of Thomas Maguire, who had been found just 1 hour earlier. Yet something about this boy made the policeman feel uneasy, and the strange sensation of déjà vu made his skin crawl as the boy inquired about his reward. John Delahunt was now their prime suspect. Join me as I investigate the forgotten story of the teenage throat slitter of 1840s Dublin, the dramatic trial and execution of John Delahunt that drew tens of thousands of people to the gates of Kilmainham Gaol, and walk with me in the footsteps of the victims and their cold-blooded and calculating killer. In the early 1840s, Dublin City had a small yet steadily growing population of Italian immigrants who mainly lived in tenement housing on Chancery Lane, Werburgh Street and Little Ship Street, an area that would soon become known as Dublin's own Little Italy. Many of these new arrivals to the city were highly skilled artisans who were employed by wealthy citizens to add stylish European stucco and woodwork to their homes. Others were ice cream vendors who walked the city with a pushcart and sold their sought-after ice creams to the excited children of the city. Many more were musicians and singers who would soon become a common sight as they performed on the streets of Victorian Dublin to the delight of the crowds. As the community steadily grew, so did a new tradition each New Year's Eve when all the Italian musicians and singers would gather together on Chancery Lane to perform an annual concert that attracted many Dubliners who sang and danced with their new neighbours as they welcomed in the new year. Sometime around 1840, a young man named Domenico Garlibardo, while still living in Italy, heard of this community in Dublin, and together with a group of his friends decided to set out on an adventure. Domenico was an organ grinder by profession, which was a popular form of street entertainment in the 19th century. The street organ allowed the operator to perform pre-recorded music by turning a hand crank while sometimes telling a story or encouraging the crowd to sing along to the tune. They were sometimes accompanied by a little capuchin monkey to further delight the crowd. Domenico and his friends soon found lodgings together in the house of John Walsh and his wife Catherine on Maiden Lane off Wood Street, just across the road from Chancery Lane, and they immediately set to work performing for the residents of Dublin. While many organ grinders preferred to stay in the city centre, Domenico discovered that there were many eager audiences waiting to be entertained in the villages and fine homes in a then very rural South Dublin. On Saturday morning, the 27th of February 1841, 22-year-old Domenico left his lodgings with a small group of friends and set out in the direction of Rathfarnham village. As they passed through Roundtown, the men began to go their separate ways, and Domenico continued to walk south, crossing the River Dodder and climbing the hill towards Rathfarnham village. He performed in the area until after sunset, both in the village and also by knocking on the door of the many homes he passed until late in the evening. Tired from his day's work, he returned to the Dodder and walked along the path south of the river in the direction of Lord Eli's Arch. Here he rested for a while by a wall under the light of the moon, while keeping his precious street organ strapped around his shoulders. Unbeknownst to Domenico, a sinister figure had been following in his footsteps and now stood watching him from the shadows while holding a sharpened kitchen knife in his right hand and a stone in his left. As Domenico turned to walk towards the wooden bridge that would bring him to Rathgar, the shadowy figure approached him quickly from behind and swung the stone at his temple. Dazed from this blow to the head, Domenico stumbled while his attacker grabbed the collar of his jacket in one hand and reached around with the knife in his other and sliced Domenico's neck open from under his left ear all the way across to the right. Not content with this first cut, he held onto Domenico as he fell to the ground and inflicted another cut that almost severed his head from his body. As Domenico lay dying on the ground, the attacker rifled through his pockets where he found and took a leather wallet containing £10, the musician's life savings. His injuries were so severe that his head remained attached to his body thanks only to a few uncut muscles and the skin on the back of his neck. Domenico Garlibardo's Irish adventure had come to a sudden and barbaric end. A short distance away, a night watchman named James Dowling from Rathgar was patrolling a field on the bank of the river that belonged to Mr. Waldron. At about 8 p.m, as he walked along the field boundary, he heard what he later described as the strongest scream he had ever heard, the scream of a foreigner. Dowling was quite disturbed by this dreadful scream, yet for some reason the night watchman did not search for the unfortunate victim, but instead decided to stay in Mr. Waldron's field and keep what he had heard to himself. Domenico's body would not be found until early the following morning, despite the fact that several people passed him by during the night. The position he fell in, close to the wall, gave his body the appearance of somebody who had taken too much drink and was sleeping it off by the side of the road. The light of the moon was not sufficient to illuminate the horrific injuries he had suffered, and he lay in this position until his discovery by Mary Fitzsimon the following dawn. News of the brutal murder spread rapidly through the neighbourhood, and the police began to search for Domenico's killer, as his body was examined for clues, and the first of many newspaper articles appeared in the press. His body was moved to a courtroom in the old police barracks in Rathfarnham, next to the Yellow House, in preparation for an inquest. However, it would be another 5 days before magistrates Sir Robert Shaw, C. Davis, Simon Foote Esquire, and the county coroner, Mr. McCarthy, gathered in the courtroom to begin the 8-day-long inquest. The body was examined in detail by the members of the jury before an official identification was made by Mr. John Walsh, Domenico's landlord in Maiden Lane. While many people welcomed members of the Italian community to Dublin, some also viewed them with suspicion, including journalists, inquest witnesses, and the police. Although Domenico was a 22-year-old man, journalists often referred to him simply as the Italian boy, while the witnesses who gave evidence at the inquest typically described Domenico and his friends as the foreigners. Suspicion immediately fell on Domenico's friends and roommates, and despite not possessing a single shred of evidence to incriminate them, the police promptly raided the Walsh's lodging house on Maiden Lane and arrested 8 Italian men, including Joseph Fracco, Michael Cicello and Giovanni Asala, under suspicion of murdering their friend. The prisoners were then escorted to Rathfarnham to be interrogated by the inquest, and by the time they arrived, the usually quiet streets of Rathfarnham were a hive of activity and excitement. Domenico's body lay on display in the court to allow the jury to see for themselves the horrendous injuries he had suffered. The room had filled to capacity with a curious rabble who strained their necks to catch a glimpse of the unfortunate man's body, and a ripple of excitement and contempt spread throughout as the prisoners were marched in. One by one, the Italian men were made to approach and lay a hand on the now decomposing body of their deceased friend, as magistrates and jurors stared intently at their faces, hoping to decipher their guilt or innocence based purely on how they reacted to the cold and bloodied skin of Domenico. Witness Charles Byrne of Rathfarnham reported seeing 2 foreigners walking quickly along Rathgar Road at about 7:30 p.m. on Saturday evening, and he identified them as 2 of the arrested men. Constable William Bradshaw, who was returning to his barracks with a young boy named Costigan, who he had just arrested for stealing some timber, saw Joseph Fracca walking on Rathfarnham Road about 30 minutes later. He described Fracca as looking composed, respectable and confident in his manner, and not disfigured in any way. He became suspicious of the man, however, initially because he thought he was someone else, and subsequently due to the promptness of his step. The men who were most likely in a hurry to return home after spending the entire day working were ordered to be held in custody for the next 5 days. When the inquest reconvened, public interest in the case had grown rapidly, and large excited crowds gathered in the streets of Rathfarnham in the hope of gaining a coveted spot in the Court of Petty Sessions to witness the events and catch a glimpse of the prisoners. While across the country, and indeed the Irish Sea, people waited with bated breath to read the latest newspaper articles that reported every minute detail of the proceedings. Many more witnesses were called who reported passing the spot where Domenico was killed, but all of them said that they believed the body to be that of a drunken man who had passed out, and they took no more notice of him. Joseph Fracca, Michael Cicello and Giovanni Asala were then questioned at length in front of the crowded courtroom regarding their movements on the night of the killing. As their English was quite limited, an interpreter by the name of Senior Crespi was present to translate. It soon became apparent to everyone present that the men had no involvement in the death of their friend. Joseph Fracca, in particular, spoke confidently and eloquently as he told the court how he remembered every house he had called to that day, exactly who had paid him to play, and was eager to retrace his steps with the police to verify his statements. The men were eventually ordered to be released from custody, and Asala, via the interpreter, issued a heartfelt plea to the court. He spoke of how, when they were leaving Italy, Domenico's brother had made him swear that no matter what happened on their travels, that he would return Domenico to his homeland and his family, be that dead or alive. He pleaded with the court to release the body to his care so he could return it to Italy at a cost of £50, which he was willing to pay himself. He did not receive an answer to his request from the court on this day, but it was suggested that a public fund should be collected for the men to allow them to return to Italy, as their reputations were so badly damaged by the affair that they were now openly mocked in the street and had little hope of returning to a normal life in Dublin. It seemed as though the inquest was about to come to an abrupt end, and that the killer would not be identified, when a witness came forward with some shocking and sensational new information. John Delahunt, a 17-year-old boy with an address on both Little Britain Street and Eastmoreland Place, walked into the police station in Dublin Castle and stated that not only did he know who the murderer was, but that he had even seen the crime take place. John Delahunt pointed the finger at Richard Cooney and his wife Mary, who soon found themselves under arrest and at the centre of the dramatic inquest. Delahunt, an occasional carpenter and messenger boy, claimed to have been so close to the scene of the crime on the night of the 27th that he not only saw the knife in Richard Cooney's hand, but also saw him raise it to Domenico's throat and watched as the blood flowed down his neck. Richard and Mary Cooney had become well-known figures in South Dublin in the 3 months since they moved to Roundtown and rented a small cottage. As members of the travelling community, they often visited the villages of South Dublin, where they offered repair services and sold pots and pans in Dundrum, Rathfarnham, Rathgar and Temple Ogue, among others. The court believed the account given by Delahunt to the police and became extremely suspicious of the Cooneys, yet once again there was a complete lack of physical evidence that implicated them in the crime, and bizarrely, Delahunt was not called as a witness during the inquest. Over the next few days, they were questioned thoroughly regarding their movements on the days leading up to Domenico's death, and a call was made for witnesses who had seen them in the area. Richard admitted that he had met Domenico on a few occasions, and the two men had chatted briefly. He stated that he had seen Domenico on the day he was murdered, but it was at 2:30 in the afternoon and further downstream on the River Dodder, and that on the evening of the murder he was attending a wake in Roundtown from 6 p.m. until 11 p.m. that night. He was also able to provide the names of the other mourners present at the wake. However, his statement was contradicted by Patrick Dunn of Rathgar Road, who told the court that the Cooneys did not arrive at the wake until about 10 p.m. that night. While the Cooneys mainly lived in Roundtown, they had also resided briefly on Church Lane in Rathfarnham village. Witness Mary Byrne, also of Church Lane, stated that on the evening of the murder, she was making her way towards the bridge at Rathfarnham Road on her way to visit her daughter in Dolphin's Barn, when she saw the Cooneys walking with Domenico and overheard Richard Cooney tell Domenico that he would show him the way to the wooden bridge further down the river that would bring him to Rathmines Road. She stated that Richard Cooney had Domenico's leather bag on his shoulder. Mary Byrne had not come forward with this information until after the Cooneys were arrested, and many in the courtroom were suspicious of the account she provided. When Mary Byrne finished telling her story, Mary Cooney was heard to scoff, "Oh, you'll get the money now." Mary Byrne was asked repeatedly by members of the jury as to why she did not come forward earlier, and if she had only done so in the hopes of receiving a reward, to which she could not provide a satisfactory answer. As the inquest drew to a close, the jury had to consider whether there was sufficient evidence to accuse Richard and Mary of the murder of Domenico, While they were certainly in the area at the time, there was nothing unusual about this. Were the witnesses to be believed, or were there people in Rathfarnham, Roundtown and Rathgar who bore a grudge against the Cooneys, or their community in general, and wished to see them convicted of a crime they did not commit? Based on the new evidence supplied by the witnesses and the claims of John Delahunt, the inquest court in Rathfarnham concluded that Richard and Mary Cooney were guilty and should be put on trial for the murder of Domenico Garlibardo. Now that the lengthy inquest was over, the public would have to wait several weeks for the drama to continue. To keep themselves occupied in the meantime, thousands of them descended daily on the crime scene next to Lord Eli's Arch, as the location of Domenico's murder became a morbid tourist attraction. One month later, Richard and Mary Cooney found themselves facing a trial for their lives in the Dublin Commission Court. The couple were placed at the bar, and the Clerk of the Crown read them their indictment. They were charged with cutting the throat of Domenico Garlibardo on the 27th of February and asked to state if they were guilty or not. Richard spoke for them both when he answered confidently and with emphasis, "I am not guilty, no more so than the child unborn." In the weeks before the trial, the prosecution for the Crown had been busy interviewing witnesses, and one in particular had caused them such concern that they decided not to call him at the trial. John Delahunt, who claimed to have seen the Cooneys murdering Domenico and should have been their star witness, now seemed to be confused and unsure of his own story. Indeed, his claims even seemed to the prosecution to be utterly improbable. Despite this, they were still determined to see the Cooneys convicted of the murder, but their hopes were soon dashed when the trial came crumbling down. When questioned thoroughly by the defence, the Cooneys' former neighbour, Mary Byrne, admitted to the court that she had not seen the Cooneys at all that night, but had only heard some voices in the distance, who she presumed to be Richard and Mary Cooney and Domenico Garlibardo. She also openly admitted that she had no intention of coming forward to the inquest until she heard that a reward had been offered. Even more shocking was the exposure of witness Patrick Bryan of Rosemount as a barefaced liar. Bryan, a dairy boy, claimed to have passed the scene of the murder on his dray and horse, where he saw Richard and Mary standing over Domenico's body in the company of two other men from the travelling community, one named Rule and the other named Murray. He claimed to have seen Richard strike a blow to Domenico and heard Mary exclaim, "Your soul to blazes, we are all taken," when they heard the approaching horse and dray. When questioned intensely by Mr. Curran for the defence, Patrick Bryan broke down and admitted that everything he had said was a lie, as the courtroom gasped in shock. Patrick Bryan, who had known the Cooneys for years, was happy to see them sent to the gallows for a crime they did not commit, was charged with perjury. It was now clear to the court that Richard and Mary Cooney were innocent, and they were promptly found not guilty. The couple walked out of the courthouse on Green Street and were confronted by a large crowd, who greeted them with a cheer, and then followed them down Petticoat Lane and onto Ormond Quay, as their accuser Patrick Bryan was taken into custody. After weeks of investigations and false accusations, the authorities were no closer to apprehending this cold-blooded murderer than they were on the day the body was discovered. The summer of 1841 passed over Dublin, and talk of the barbarous killing in Rathfarnham faded with the retreating summer light. The evenings had once again become dark and cold. In a laneway off Pembroke Road, Elizabeth Waters prepared a meal of bacon and potatoes for her young children John and Bessie in the shabbily converted horse stable they called home. It was just 5 days before Christmas, as the children hungrily devoured their meal. Feeling sufficiently warmed by the hot food, they ventured out into the lane to play before bed. It had just passed 6:30 p.m. The laneway was lit only by the moon, yet they felt no fear, as this was their playground. They made their way down the lane when John spotted something strange lying on the ground. The siblings moved slowly forward in the darkness as the shape of a motionless boy was revealed to their innocent eyes. The boy was laying on his side, his ragged clothing bathed in his own blood, and his feet bare and dirty from the cold winter streets on which she had once walked. The children turned and ran for their home to tell their mother that a boy lay dead in the laneway. Elizabeth Waters made her way down the lane, where she too found the boy. She placed a hand on his arm, and as she did so, let out a small sigh of relief. The boy was quite warm. Perhaps he was not dead at all. It was far too dark, however, to tell exactly what had happened to him, and she left the scene in search of a candle. As she made her way back, Elizabeth spotted a police constable, and she called out to him for help. By the light of the candle, Elizabeth and the constable knelt down by the boy in the hope of reviving him, but instead they drew back in horror. A large open wound was clearly visible on his neck. Elizabeth had never seen his face before. Soon more police arrived on the scene, and Inspectors Durham, Carmody and Finnemore led the investigation, and plans were made for an inquest to be held in a nearby public house called Fleming's. The boy was clearly not a local, as the many people who lined up to view the body failed to identify him. The police described him as a very handsome boy, having bright black eyes, good features and curly brown hair. A short distance from Fleming's public house and the scene of the crime, a young man hurriedly set out into the night from his father's house on Eastmoreland Place. He walked with purpose along St. Stephen's Green as he excitedly recounted in his mind what he had just witnessed. Constable Edward Barrett, sitting in his office in the lower yard of Dublin Castle, looked at his clock as the door opened and John Delahunt walked in from the darkness. It was 7:30 p.m, barely an hour since the grim discovery on Pembroke Lane, and while those who placed their hand on the body could still feel the fading warmth of life, Barrett could tell from the eager look on Delahunt's face that he had something important to tell him. John Delahunt gave the following statement to Barrett. It was a woman who perpetrated the crime. I did not hear any voice. The child did not cry. This was between 5 and 6 o'clock in the evening of Monday the 20th instant. I saw the woman clearly. She wore a large plaid shawl, red and green, and a dark gown. She had a plain cap on her. She was about 28 to 30 years of age to all appearances. I do not know the colour of her hair clearly, but I think it was black. I was at Mr. T. Clark's of 123 Lower Baggot Street with a letter on Monday evening, and was coming from it when I first saw the woman. I saw the deceased child with her. They were both going from Baggot Street towards the bridge. The woman was beating the child on the neck. She bid him go on. The child looked very cold and was in his bare feet. I was in view of the woman to the corner of the lane. I saw her go down the stable lane. I crossed through a field. I was quite close to the wall when the child was murdered. I could see over the wall. I did not know she was going to murder the child. When she cut the throat of the child, she threw it from her, but it scrambled up on its feet again. It did not stand up quite straight. She threw it away. She ran off. She ran towards Haddington Road. I did not call out, nor did I pursue her. I had a sore foot and a pain in my back, and therefore could not pursue her. I did not go to the child at all. Delahunt told the policeman that although he did not recognise the woman, he was confident that he could identify her should he see her again. Barrett listened intently to the story, but as he stared across his desk at Delahunt, he became increasingly uneasy. This was not the first, or even the second time, that young John Delahunt had been an eyewitness to a violent crime. He recalled the investigation into the death of Domenico Garlibardo, the dubious claims made by Delahunt that incriminated Richard and Mary Cooney in the murder of the organ grinder, and the eerily familiar method that was used to kill the unidentified boy just 1 hour earlier. At that moment, Edward Barrett knew that he was speaking to a murderer. He placed John Delahunt under arrest. The following day, an inquest into the death of the young boy took place in Fleming's public house on Baggot Street. Once again, news of the murder had drawn much public attention, and when the arrest of John Delahunt became public knowledge, the excitement and curiosity reached a fever pitch and was reported as follows. When it was known that the dreadful deed had been perpetrated, the greatest excitement and horror pervaded the neighbourhood. The excitement continued yesterday during the inquest. Great crowds visited the spot where the barbarous murder was committed and remained in the jury room and about the house in which the inquest was held during the entire day. The person who was deemed to be the principal witness in the case was a lad of about 20 years named John Delahunt. It will be recollected that this boy was the chief evidence brought forward by the Crown against the tinker Cooney and his wife some months since. The body of the murdered child lay in the lane where the shocking deed was perpetrated. It presented a ghastly spectacle. The throat of the unfortunate victim was cut from ear to ear. There was also a gash over the right eye, seemingly caused by some angular instrument. A cap and a stone besmeared with blood were found a short distance from the murdered boy. John Delahunt was both prisoner and star witness at the inquest that followed. He recounted the story he told Barrett the evening before to a fascinated and horrified courtroom. As witness after witness had their say, it became increasingly obvious that rather than the mystery woman in the red and green shawl, it was John Delahunt himself who had murdered the boy. The most damning evidence of the inquest came from John Delahunt's own family, and in particular his brother Thomas. I am brother to John Delahunt. I live in Little Britain Street, corner of Mary Street. I saw my brother yesterday between 7 and 8 o'clock in the evening in my own room in Britain Street. He had a little child with him, who I had never seen before. The child was about 9 or 10 years old. He called the child into the room, but did not call it by name. My wife told the child to come over to the fire, and there being some potatoes lying at hand, she asked him was he hungry. The child said he was. My wife asked him his name, and the child replied, Tom Maguire. She asked him where he lived. He said he did not know. They stayed in the room for 10 minutes. He took out the child and said he was bringing it to Buckingham Street. He said a policeman in Lower Castle Yard knew all about the child, and Major Brown told him to take the child home as he was going out on his beat and could not do so. I have seen the dead child, and to the best of my opinion, he is the same child that was alive in my room last night. Witness James Harford confirmed the boy's identity as Thomas Maguire, son of a biscuit baker also named Thomas, and that he lived with his mother Anne Maguire on Plunkett Street. Rosanna Martin also identified the boy, saying that she heard the mother of the child say its father often beat him and cut his head with the heel of a shoe. The mother, she told the court, was extremely fond of her child. Despite the mounting evidence against him, John Delahunt continued to declare his innocence, stating that he had no idea what his family were talking about, but the members of the jury no longer believed a single word he said. The public were then ordered to withdraw, and after a quarter of an hour, the door being thrown open and Delahunt being brought in custody, the coroner told him that the jury had fully considered the evidence brought before them and had agreed in bringing a verdict of willful murder against him, John Delahunt, for the murder of Thomas Maguire. The prisoner did not say anything, but looked wildly around the room. He was then committed to Kilmainham under the coroner's warrant to stand his trial. His manner was quite composed throughout the inquest, but his answers, as appears by his evidence, were quite contradictory. He is much changed in appearance since the time he was brought forward as evidence in the trial for the murder at Rathfarnham. He is now thin and haggard in appearance. The inquest did not terminate until 9 o'clock. John Delahunt spent the following few weeks in a cell in Kilmainham Gaol as he awaited his trial. During this time, he maintained his innocence and attempted to shift blame onto Thomas's mother, who he had now decided was the mystery woman he saw commit the murder. Luckily for Anne Maguire, she was able to provide a bulletproof alibi, as at the exact time of the killing, she was in the lying-in hospital giving birth to Thomas's brother. On the morning of the 14th of January 1842, the crowds that had been gathering outside the courthouse since before first light spilled out into the surrounding streets, and many of those who pushed forward in the hopes of catching a glimpse of the murderer found themselves unable to get any closer than the corner of Little Britain Street and the home of John Delahunt's brother and sister-in-law. At 9:30 a.m, The prisoner was ushered into the court in front of their lordships, Justice Torrance and Baron Penfather, as the public gallery creaked under the weight of the curious masses, and the prisoner stood pensively at the bar. His countenance was pale and haggard, and betokened extreme anxiety. On taking his place at the bar, he covered the lower portions of his features with a handkerchief and leaned forward on his arms, in which position he remained during nearly the entire proceedings. The prisoner is of the middle height and of slight but sinewy make. The expression of his eyes is particularly unpleasant. They are wild and unsettled, with a peculiar glare. His mouth is large, coarse, and ill-formed. His forehead is narrow and rather receding, and the entire configuration of his head presents an example, but not a striking one, of that form which recent phrenologists have denominated the criminal type. The Clerk of the Crown read out the indictment of murder, to which Delahunt replied, "Not guilty," as he looked across the court to his family members, who sat among the witnesses that were about to seal his fate. Mr. Brewster, on behalf of the Crown, laid out the case against John Delahunt. He told the jury of how the boy, Thomas Maguire, lived with his mother in Plunkett Street, and that about 1 or 2 o'clock on the day the murder was committed, he asked her leave to go play with some other little children. At that period, the wretched mother was in an advanced state of pregnancy and had the misfortune of being separated from her husband, or at least abandoned by him, after treating her with a degree of harshness, and there was consequently no other person to take care of the little child. The child, after he had obtained his mother's consent, went into Blackhole Row in the neighbourhood of Francis Street and was amusing himself with other little children when a person came up. One of the questions that the jury would have to try was whether or not the prisoner at the bar was that individual. It appeared that the child knew him, whoever he may turn out to be, for when he called him by his name, the little fellow answered and immediately went with him and left his companions. It was alleged that some hours later, John Delahunt arrived at the house of his brother, Thomas Delahunt, at 11 Little Britain Street in the company of Thomas Maguire, where they stayed for a short time, and John told his family that he had been asked by the police at Dublin Castle to return the lost boy to his home. From there, Delahunt took the boy to Drake's public house on Capel Street, where they stayed for half an hour and drank 2 mugs of coffee. After this, the court was told that Delahunt and the boy were next seen walking on Upper Bagot Street towards the bridge, where Delahunt encountered his sister, and also told her that he had been charged with returning the boy to his home in Bull's Bridge. Delahunt then left his sister and walked in the direction of Bull's Bridge. However, just 20 minutes later, he arrived at the Delahunt family home on Eastmoreland Place without the boy. He excitedly informed his sister that he had to rush to Dublin Castle as he had some good news to tell them. It was alleged that during this 20-minute window, Delahunt murdered Thomas in the laneway. He then made his way to Dublin Castle to inform them of the murder he had just witnessed. The court was told that John Delahunt bore no grudge against Anne Maguire, her abusive husband, or their son Thomas. Instead, his sole motivation for committing this heinous act was to receive the reward money for identifying the killer. One of the first witnesses called was 9-year-old William Butler, who lived next to Thomas Maguire on Plunkett Street. He recalled how he had been playing with Thomas on Blackhole Row, along with John and Pat Fox, when a man called Thomas away, and they walked off together in the direction of Patrick Street. He had never seen this man before, and regrettably stated that he could not identify him. This was soon to be of little importance, however, as the most damning evidence of the day was about to be given by Margaret Delahunt, John's sister-in-law. She described how, on the evening of the 20th of December, John Delahunt had arrived at the house on Little Britain Street with the boy in tow. She asked him his name, to which he replied, Thomas Maguire. She asked where he lived, but he said he did not know. She asked him if he was hungry, to which he said yes, and she gave him a potato which he devoured. She then turned to John and pleaded, "For God's sake, take him home. His parents must be distracted about him." Margaret told of how she went to see the body the next day after hearing about the murder, and she was positive it was the same boy who was in her home the evening before. When she had finished, Margaret Delahunt was handed a knife and was asked if she recognised it, and she immediately replied yes. It was her kitchen knife, the only one she possessed, and it had been missing from her home since the 20th of December last. A sharp intake of breath was heard in the courtroom, and by the time Margaret had finished her next sentence, the case was all but over. I saw the prisoner sharpen this knife on Saturday previous, along with his brother's knife. In the minds of the jury, a disturbing and sinister image appeared, that of John Delahunt sitting in the yard of 11 Little Britain Street as he sharpened Margaret's kitchen knife and carefully planned the murder of young Thomas Maguire. The knife had been found by a boy while playing in a field close to the scene of the murder and about 20 yards from Delahunt's home on Eastmoreland Place. The case for the Crown closed at 3:15, and at 5 o'clock the jury retired to consider their verdict. The jury, after being out of the court for 20 minutes, returned and handed in a verdict of guilty. Judge Torrance pronounced the sentence of death on the culprit at great length and with much eloquence. The learned judge, in the course of his address, said he could not surmise any other motive for the horrible deed than that of a hope in the mind of the prisoner that he would have obtained a reward for giving the information, in which case he must have also resolved of swearing away the life of some innocent person. The convict was sentenced to be hanged on Saturday the 5th of February. The culprit heard his sentence with apparent composure until the close, when he fell in the dock, apparently senseless and almost lifeless. After a lapse of about 10 minutes, he recovered from a faint and was removed to a covered car, in which he was conveyed back to Kilmainham Gaol. An immense crowd gathered in front of the courthouse, and every street in the vicinity was blocked up by a vast concourse of the curious and the idle. The morning was beautifully serene, mild and genial as the opening of a summer's day, contrasting strikingly with the horror of the dreadful tragedy enacting at the jail. At an early hour, a strong detachment of police were stationed in various parts at and surrounding the jail to prevent any rush or violence from the crowd. A number of the police were placed in the fields at the rear of the houses fronting the prison to protect them from the populace and restrain them from climbing on the roofs and otherwise injuring property. So early as 8 o'clock, a number of the rabble assembled near the prison and evinced the utmost impatience that the execution should take place. The proprietress of the house immediately opposite the jail let her windows at 1 shilling per head to spectators whose taste was so depraved as to induce them to enjoy the brutal entertainment. The police force present amounted to 200 foot, 20 horse and 30 constabulary force from Clontarf. The executioner was the same man who performed the last office of the law in the case of Robinson, who was hung for a felonious assault near Bray 7 years ago. His name was not disclosed, lest he should be exposed to any violence from the populace, who, upon all such occasions, execrate a hangman as much as a culprit. The wretched animal slept well on Friday night, and also employed his time in meditation. At 9 o'clock he ate a hearty breakfast. His animal propensities must have been very strong, for he dined well on Friday night and breakfasted heartily in the morning. His fear of death did not appear to have sprung from any punishment resulting from his crimes in another world, but from a horror of the scorn and exultations of the crowd and the disgrace which his crimes and ignominious death will necessarily entail upon his family. An artist attended to take a cast of his face and head. One of the Roman Catholic clergymen who were in attendance objected to it upon the ground that it would be cruel to render the last moment of the unhappy youth still more appalling by such a proceeding, but he waived his objection to the cast being taken, and being told that it would not be done until after his death. At 12 o'clock, the criminal was led forth from the chapel, in which, assisted by Messrs. Canavan, O'Reilly, Campbell, Kirby and Mooney, he had been up to that time employed in religious preparations for his approaching doom. He was so feeble that one of the clergymen by whom he was accompanied and the hangman were obliged to support and lead him along by either hand. He was instantly led to the scaffold and placed upon it. The hangman, whose face was covered with a white cloth with small holes cut into it to enable him to see, enveloped his head in a covering similar to that worn by himself. During the ceremony, the officiating priest read prayers in which the culprit joined. Towards the close of the prayers, he became very weak and fell upon his knees in a fainting state. He rallied again, but was a second time overcome by his terrors. Some person who was near him, we believe a clergyman, exclaimed, "John, John, stand up in the name of God." He partially recovered and was stepping back, as if anxious to escape into the press room, when the final bolt was withdrawn and he was launched into eternity. His sufferings were very temporary. A few muscular contractions and a slight convulsive agitation of his body were all the indications of pain observed in his death. Never was terror more depicted in a human countenance than in his. It was pallid and death-like, and his frame, which was slight and weakly, exhibited by its tremulousness the feelings of horror and fear with which he awaited his execution. It is but just to the populace to say that we did not observe in an assembly consisting of 20 or 30,000 people who had flocked from all parts of the city a single drunken man or woman, and that they witnessed the execution without indulging in indecent exultation or exhibiting towards the culprit that savage indifference to his agonies which characterised the feelings evinced by mobs on similar occasions hitherto. When he appeared upon the drop, a slight murmur ran through the crowd, not of indignation, not of scorn. It partook of something of a religious character. It was like a murmur of a prayer. There was no shout, no outrage, no violence. The populace were better behaved on this occasion than on any within our remembrance. We are pleased in being able to record a gratifying fact that very few women were amongst the crowd, and not one respectable female. This circumstance is remarkable, for women have been proverbial for attending executions, and have frequently dishonoured their sex by the interest taken by them in such loathsome exhibitions. The High Sheriff, Mr. Bagot, and the Sub-Sheriff were present to see the sentence of law carried into effect. The time required by law of 40 minutes for the body of the culprit to remain suspended having expired, it was cut down for interment within the precincts of the prison. He was not treated with severity, deprived of any nourishment which he might reasonably expect to receive, or placed in a lonely and darksome cell, where on horror's head horrors accumulate, but was, on the contrary, treated with clemency and kindness. The crowd dispersed quietly. John Delahunt's body was placed in a grave in the prison yard of Kilmainham Gaol. The location was chosen as it lay in the farthest corner of the prison grounds, a spot where no other prisoner had previously been buried. In the moments leading up to his execution, Delahunt finally relented and confessed in full to the murder of Thomas Maguire. He refused to accept any involvement in the death of Domenico Garlibardo. However, he did admit to providing a false witness statement, which led to the arrest and trial of Richard and Mary Cooney. He also admitted to providing a false statement that accused 3 coal porters of a vicious assault on one Mr. Craddock in his home on Mead Street during the previous summer. The 3 men had been arrested and put on trial, but the case collapsed when John Delahunt was questioned as a witness, and it became apparent to the jury and even the Crown prosecution that not a single word he said could be believed. Delahunt was never tried for the murder of Domenico Garlibardo, but it was widely believed by the authorities, the press and the public alike that he was the murderer, and just like the Thomas Maguire case, his sole motivation had been the £100 reward money offered by Dublin Castle. What follows is the confession of John Delahunt as published in newspapers a few days after his death. It offers an unsettling insight into the mind of a cold-blooded killer that stalked the streets of Victorian Dublin. Some portions of the confession relating to Thomas have been omitted as they are too disturbing to publish. I state positively that I had neither hand, act nor part in the death of Garlibardo, the Italian boy. I was that night in town. In a few days after the commission of the deed, I went, accompanied by my brother Thomas, to view the spot. Seeing many persons climbing over the wall and going into the Marquis of Ely's domain, we went over the wall also. As it was coming nigh Palm Sunday, my brother broke down a branch from one of the trees, and we brought it home. When I was afterwards confined in the castle as a crown witness against Cooney and his wife, my mother came to see me, and it occurred to me that by referring to that branch of the tree at my home, it would corroborate my testimony. I accordingly bid her to say I brought the branch home the night of the murder, which she did, and on referring to this circumstance, and having been sent with Head Constable Towers to see if my statement was correct, I at once pointed out the exact tree, and thus obtained more credence for my story. But I solemnly assert I knew nothing of the facts of the case, unless by reading them as detailed in the newspapers. I swore against Cooney and his wife, in the hopes of having pay at the castle. I also swore against the men for the attack on Mr. Craddock for the same motive, and without knowing any of them. When I saw the proclamation offering the reward, I went to the house where Mr. Craddock lived, and got all the particulars from an old woman, and then went and swore against the men. I accused them by mere chance. What I stated of them was false. As to the child, Thomas Maguire, I do now confess that the hope of getting again into the pay of the castle was the strong motive for committing the deed. I thought I could fix it on someone in the course of time, and if I had succeeded, I don't know, but I might have done a similar deed again, had my conscience yielded to a similar temptation. I kept him nearly half an hour in the lane. He twice asked me if I was coming home soon. I said I was waiting for a jaunting car. He spent part of the time sitting in the corner at the stable door on a heap of dung or litter heaped up outside. I was turning in my mind how I would cut his throat. He stood up then by my side. I felt his throat and asked him, had he lumps in his throat? He made no reply. His back was then to me, and at that moment, while he was in that position, with his head drawn back, I cut his throat and threw him from me. I planned the deed for nearly 2 months before, but could not, up to the day of the murder, find a proper object, and besides, I was often terrified in my own mind at the contemplation of it. My real object was, I repeat, not the desire of the killing or destroying a human being, but merely and solely to obtain a reward. I wish to state those matters, that the world may know the truth before my death, and that there may be no misconception on the mind of anyone concerning me. This was not quite the end of John Delahunt's story, however. As he was being sent to his death, a group of men waited anxiously in the wings of the prison to get their hands on the skull of a convicted murderer. Phrenology, a pseudoscience that studied the shape of an individual's skull in order to ascertain their psychological traits and mental capacity, was extremely popular at the time, and a cast of Delahunt's skull was just what these men needed, and their findings were duly published in the newspapers. The complete cast of the criminal's head, which is now to be seen at Senior Nanetti's on Church Lane, enables us to lay before our readers a fuller account of this most singular illustration of the phrenological system. When a front view was taken of his countenance, it revealed the extremely narrow compass of his forehead, and with the great width at the base of the brain and a large mouth, gave him what must have been an air of brutality. The consequences of such a combination of organs, admitting the principles of phrenologists, must be obvious to all, and cannot be contemplated without shuddering. With a mind that placed him in the low order of intellect, acquisitiveness that prompted the commission of crime for the most sordid motives, destructiveness that gave him a taste for blood, firmness that afforded him sufficient hardihood for a desperate deed, the almost total want of the moral restraints of the conscientiousness, not even calculating caution to hold him back, and a few of the warmer social affections of our nature to soften the more severe propensities of his disposition. With such a combination of the worst ingredients of humanity, it is no wonder that he should have been a dangerous member of the community. Under other circumstances, with a religious education and free from the temptations attending poverty, his case would, of course, have been different. The following May, it was reported that Mr. Wilson, Professor of Phrenology, delivered his first lecture on phrenology at the Mechanics Institute last night. The theatre was well filled. He exhibited several casts, among others one of the head of the unfortunate Delahunt, which attracted much attention. It came highly recommended that a model of the skull of John Delahunt should form part of the collection of any self-respecting phrenologist. Following the inquest in Rathfarnham in early 1841, the body of Domenico Garlibardo was temporarily stored in the graveyard in Rathfarnham village. The request of his friends to have the body released to their care was eventually granted, and his remains were returned to his family in Parma for burial. The question is, what became of poor Thomas Maguire? Following the inquest, his remains were taken to a barracks in Irishtown, where members of the public were allowed to view the body. The lives of the poor are often the first to be forgotten, and this seemed to be the case for Thomas, until I happened across the only newspaper article that mentioned his burial. Thomas Maguire was finally laid to rest in St. Kevin's graveyard on Camden Row. St. Kevin's is now a public park, and the majority of headstones have been moved from their original positions and are very difficult to read. And taking into consideration the fact that his family could not afford to provide him with shoes, means that he may never have had a headstone in the first place. Thomas Maguire was born into the slums of Dublin sometime around 1831. He lived in poverty for the entirety of his short life. He was loved by his mother, beaten by his father, murdered by John Delahunt, and was buried in this graveyard on Christmas Day, 1841.